Nation. My mother's from Cherie. And it's an honor to be here tonight. And it's part of my teachings and protocols that when we gather like this, that we open with a song. And I'd also like to share that I'm first generation. I didn't go to residential school, and my parents went and OSU. And what we're doing now is a really big step for First Nations people. And when we're releasing books and moving up, I want to say gigantic step for us. Because what I was told is that we weren't allowed to go higher than grade 10. We weren't allowed to acknowledge ourselves like this. So it's a really honor, and it fills my heart to see many nations in here tonight. And how we gather like this, it's part of our teachings that we start with a song. So the song I'd like to share with you tonight, is our eagle song. Because when we're together, the eagle flies the highest. And what I like to say is he carries our prayers. And you all have a good night.
That is Les George, who is the new Indigenous storyteller in residence at VPL. Please give him a hand. Yeah. And if you want to find out about all the programs that he's going to be leading and all the work he's going to be doing here as a storyteller in residence, you can find out up on our website, so vpl.ca/storyteller. Hey everyone, welcome to the Alice Mackay Room. Wonderful to see you all here. My name's Jorge Amigo. I'm the head of cultural programming for the Vancouver Public Library. Continuing with what Les George was saying, I want to acknowledge that we are hosting this event from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And I want to share that I'm an immigrant from Mexico, and therefore I'm a settler in these lands, which means I have a responsibility to continually learn about the ongoing effects of colonialism in this part of the world, and to take sincere actions as a public servant towards decolonization, especially as I work at a public library. So tonight's event feels particularly important because we're here for a conversation between two of Canada's most important Indigenous writers, whose work has helped illuminate the stories, the reality, and the lived experience of Indigenous people in this country. So it's fantastic to have a packed house for this, to see all of you here. Very grateful that the Vancouver Writers Festival partners with us for this series called Incite, which brings the best writers to our stages. So thank you for that partnership. Before I pass it on to Leslie, I just have a couple of quick housekeeping notes for you. The first one is really obvious. The bathrooms are right outside to the right. You probably saw them when you were coming in. So if you need to exit at any point during the event, you can exit through those two doors. We're not at the ballet. This is not the symphony. You can leave whenever you want and come back. That's the key. You can also leave at the symphony. You just can't come back. And the other housekeeping note is everyone has phones in their pockets these days, and they make a lot of noise. So that's distracting to not only your fellow audience members, but to the people on stage. So please make sure they're silent. You don't have to turn them off. In fact, please keep them on and take pictures and post stories on Instagram or TikTok or whatever social media you use. I encourage you to post any pictures and videos. So yeah, take a moment to silence your phones. And that's it from me. It's a pleasure to introduce Leslie Herdig, the Artistic Director of the Vancouver Writers Festival.
Thank you, Jorge, and thank you, Les, as well. Good evening, and welcome to our third Insight of 2023. It warms my heart to bring Cherie Dimaline back to Vancouver and to be able to host her alongside Billy-Ray Belcourt at Incite tonight. Hello, by the way, to all of our viewers watching online. We are live streaming this event tonight, and there are plenty of people watching from home as well. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge this great partnership between the Vancouver Writers Fest and the Vancouver Public Library. Thank you so much for being our partners and hosting some very compelling and exciting events through till June. And I'd also like to thank all of our government sponsors, which you can find on our website if you take a little peek. The Vancouver Writers Fest does program events year-round, including Incite events every other Wednesday, and multiple special events, including one coming up with Eleanor Catton, which is taking place March 11th, and tickets for that are on sale now. Soon I am going to turn things over to our excellent host this evening, Billy-Ray Belcourt. Cherie and Billy-Ray will chat for about an hour before turning it over to you for some questions. And then there will be a book signing just over here. And we would like to thank our excellent bookseller this evening, Massy Books, who is also partnering on this event with us. I understand from Patricia Massy that for this night only, the books are 15% off as well. So this is an excellent time to pick up your copy of VenCo and Cherie's backlist titles, as well as some of Billy-Ray's titles as well. So there are some authors who are both so prolific and engaging that we can't help to bring them back time after time. Cherie Dimaline first visited the Vancouver Writers Fest in 2017 with her debut YA title, The Marrow Thieves. Have any of you ever heard of that book before by any chance? Since then, that book has gone on to win multiple awards, sit atop the Canadian bestseller list for I don't know how long, forever? 5 years atop the Canadian bestseller list. It was named one of Time Magazine's best YA books of all time, you know, stuff like that. And it's found its way onto curriculum lists across North America as well, which is pretty remarkable. Still, Cherie did not rest. She wrote a widely praised sequel called Hunting by Stars, which came out last year, a #1 best-selling adult fiction title, Empire of the Wild, and now this gorgeously witchy new ride, VenCo, which is one of the most fast-paced and fun and kind of joyfully inclusive books that I've read in a really long time. Cherie is a member of the Georgian Bay Métis community where she lives and writes. And joining Cherie on stage tonight is our moderator this evening, Billy-Ray Belcourt. Speaking of prolific and engaging, Billy-Ray is the author of 4 acclaimed books, including This Wound is World, Ending Copian Mechanisms, A History of My Brief Body, and A Minor Chorus, which came out just last year. He is also an assistant professor at UBC Creative Writing and a member of the Driftpile Cree Nation, and one of our favorite authors to host at the festival as well. Please welcome Cherie and Billy-Ray Belcourt.
Hello.
Doesn't this feel like when you go to elementary school and you have to like slide into those desks with the connected table?
Very that.
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to have you all here and to be in conversation with Cherie. I think you're going to open with a short reading.
Oh, did you really want me to do a short reading?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to. I have a copy of the book. I mean, okay. How about we we'll start a conversation.
Okay, we'll start
midway through.
Okay, and then but we have to find a section of the book that doesn't have any F-bombs in it. Or we could look for the parts that have F-bombs in it. All right? They're down for it. They're like, do it. Do the sexy bits.
Just quick show of hands. Who here has already read the book? Okay, love that. I think it's one of those books that as soon as you start reading it, you really can't stop reading it. And and to go back to Leslie's point about Cherie and I are on similar publication timelines, but Cherie's books are like 3 times the size of mine. So,
but Billy-Ray writes poetry, which I'll tell you a quick story. So my late auntie, the great Lee Miracle, when we were working on one of my books, she said, "Well, your prose is very poetic. Maybe you should write poetry." And I went, "Oh my God, I could be a poet." Because I really, really love poets. I read poetry when I'm writing because it's so inspirational. And so I wrote this poem and I brought it back to her the next week and she said, never do that again. So.
Love that. I'm like not sure how to, seamlessly transition towards the questions.
I'll sit in my humiliation over.
Okay, but to not so seamlessly transition to the question I have, I wanted to begin by asking you about, so as I was reading, I kept thinking about all of the other sort of pop cultural texts that portray witches. Yeah. And I wondered which of these sort of informed the background of your book.
Yeah, so there is really no end to the witch stories that are out there. And in fact, as I realized when we were sort of coming up with the timeline for publication, that there was a lot of witch books coming out in the last little while. And I think my favorite has to be history. It has to be the historical texts. I mean, we know that the printing press became hugely popular in part because of the Inquisition, because of the fact that they were trying to get these pamphlets and books and instructions out for how to find these devilish people and deal with them. So there's a lot of historical text that's available. And then there's some brilliant work that's being done. I read a biography of Pamela Coleman Smith, who was a queer, biracial occultist and artist, who was the artist who did the Rider-Waite tarot deck. Yeah. So we know so let's take that in. It's called the Rider-Waite tarot deck after the 2 men that put the tarot deck out, but it was this queer femme of color who actually designed it. And so I was looking into her history and sort of how women moved through these occult, there's things like Order of the Golden Dawn and Thelema and all these different schools of thought. And what we don't hear, or what we didn't hear for a long time, was the queer voices and the femmes who were involved in the movements. And so a lot of those books are coming out now. And I think that's really where I draw my most inspiration from. And then let me tell you though, when you're doing a book on witchcraft, Billy-Ray, there are like 38,000 rabbit holes you can fall down. Yeah. I literally was buried in like my office. I say my office because it sounds fancy, but it's just like a room in my house that me and my wiener dog go to when I write. But I was, buried in all of these old texts and these books, and then I was like, binge watching all of these shows. And the one thing that I found in a lot of popular culture, especially on television shows, was that they tried to relate witchcraft to something grander, as if there could be something grander than ordinary magic. but that they were descended from these immortals, that there was some big portal to another world. And so I really wanted to do the opposite. I wanted to talk about how magic is accessible, how the extraordinary is always in the ordinary, and how we are all connected to it already.
So do you feel like you were intervening into a discourse?
I feel like I was like record scratch on the whole, there's also this idea that like witchcraft is a European thing, which is not true. There are witches all over the world in almost every community through all eras of history. So it was really just a chance to, have a lot of fun, take down the entire patriarchy, and also, tell these stories that I think, to me it felt like the robbery felt like not that we didn't have this great content to consume, but that so many powerful people who were naturally connected in this way had no idea or were removed somehow from their power. That there's this idea that you have to go to a specific house and you have to get a man to like connect your call to God. Just felt like such a robbery of our power.
So in the book, so magic, of course, is literal in the book, but it seems to also have this kind of allegorical resonance. And to pivot slightly, I think one of the things that was most interesting to me about the book is the way that it, or the way that you align the character's thinking aligns with some sort of currents in contemporary anti-colonial and decolonial knowledge. And one of the ways that happens is through the understanding of magic as being bound up in land, in territory. So I don't think it's just, some witches are most powerful in their ancestral territory in the novel, for example. And I wondered if you could discuss, why was it important for you to root some of these fantastical elements in our critical discourse?
I knew you were going to say critical discourse. I knew it. If you guys don't know, Billy-Ray Belcourt is the smartest kid on the block in any city. And when they told me Billy-Ray was going to be interviewing me, I was really excited because I love him dearly. He's my family. But I also was terrified because I'm like, this kid is going to say things. I get critical discourse, though. I know. I'm smart. I got it. Okay. Professor Belcourt. So one of the things that I really wanted to talk about was this idea of everybody's favorite, New Agers. And I wanted to take the narrative back. And so one of the things that we know that is highly problematic is there is a theft from people's traditions, and people's ceremonial, and intellectual property, which in some cases is one and the same. And I wanted to be very specific. So in the story, our main character, her name is Lucky St. James. She's Métis from my community. She's living in Toronto, and she goes on this sort of wild adventure. And she ends up in places, and at one moment she's in New Orleans, and she's asking one of the wisdom keepers there, how can I take on this villain? There's a villain. There's always a villain. He's hot. Villains should always be hot. And so she's, trying to come up with ways. And the wise woman says to her, "Well, this is voodoo territory, and that's not for you." And so she doesn't pick it up because and I think Empire of Wild started this way, where it discussed the fact that even when we forget our medicine, even when we forget our way, the land doesn't forget. And so if we are in a place where we can be connected to those original teachings, that's an incredible place of power. And so really what happens is I wanted to tell this witchy story, and so there's a coven, and I didn't sit down and think, well, I need to, make sure that I'm appealing to the most amount of people, or I need to make sure that I'm checking boxes. I literally asked myself this question. I said, okay, if what I'm talking about, if this small task that I'm taking on with this novel is collapsing capitalism by kicking out the twin pillars of colonialism and patriarchy from underneath it.
That's a great elevator pitch, by the way.
Professor Belcourt. Then who are the witches that could possibly accomplish this? That was the question that led to the characters. And so when I thought about it, there's not one witch in this group that if you took one of them away, and it's very plain in the book, they could not accomplish their mission. And so what we needed were people who were connected to different lands, to different traditions. We absolutely needed that coven to be led by queer kin, because we're talking about people who successfully build a resistance that somehow centers and holds joy. Who else in history, right, has been able to move in the amazing, incredible ways that you've had to move to survive as queer people? You hold and center joy within the resistance. You can't wait for the other side. And so this was the question that then led to the specific witches, which then led to them being more powerful in certain places because of their teachings. Mm-hmm. Because I didn't want to leave the narrative up like, yes, we are all connected. Yes, we all have stories. Yes, we are all capable of magic. No, not all magic is for you, Karen.
So your response touched on essentially all my other questions, but I want to say,
I win!
A+.
Yes.
What I think is beautiful about the work is that it's sort of, you bypass all of these kind of debates that are happening, right, and have been happening in feminist studies, in indigenous studies, about how to make cross-cultural solidarity possible or transnational solidarity possible. And you don't think about what makes that difficult. You just imagine an instance or a situation in when that already exists, that transnational solidarity already exists. Mm. And to go back to your point about anti-capitalism, that's a current that runs throughout the book. And there's a couple of ways it comes up, most notably in a character reflects that part of what's radical about magic is that it can't be commoditized. Mm-hmm. And the book opens also with the twin catastrophes of housing insecurity and gentrification. Mm-hmm. And some novels or some novelists would think about acknowledging those crises, but then sort of avoid addressing their roots and also avoid imagining alternatives to them. But your novel does imagine alternatives to them. And I wondered, and you already hinted at this about the sort of the seven witches requiring each other. Mm-hmm. So there's this communal mode of living that the novel imagines and takes up. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you had anything to say about the novel, because historically it's been this individualizing force. Mm-hmm. How is it already a collectivizing force? Or do you think of the novel when when you wrote VenCo, for example, were you thinking of it as something that could, be communal also, despite being written, by a singular person?
In my pajamas, yeah. through the pandemic. Absolutely, Billy-Ray. So first of all, it was written throughout the pandemic, and I was really craving community. There's something about, and you all can relate, being in isolation, especially when you are from a community, that really can become quite toxic. It's like you're the only voice in the room, and so who's going to talk you down? Like yourself? No, I catastrophize. I can come up with 42 ways that something's going to happen. All of them will be terrible. So it becomes difficult, and so I wanted to. I also was really listening, and something that was happening was I saw people feeling disconnected from their lands, from their homes. Mm-hmm. So they felt like they were without roots, and that they were disconnected from their belief systems, their structures, their deities. their spirituality. And so there was kind of this moment where it felt like we were all kind of floating aimlessly through the ether. And so I really wanted to write something that was both grounding and liberating, so that, you know, we know the only way you can truly reach with the greatest distance is to have roots that hold you steady. So that was a part of it. So quite literally for me, the novel was community building. Mm-hmm. But I think with this book, for the first time, from the beginning, I was really thinking about how it could bring people together. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about what happens, you know, in a culture where negativity gets a lot of attention, where, you know, if we turn on one another, or if we, you know, sort of drive into the negativity and pulling down, there's some clout to that. What happens when we stand together? What happens, and in particular, I was thinking, what happens when, you know, Black, Indigenous, femmes of color, you know, queer community members, when we stand together and support each other, when we truly stand in a circle? What is the holy joy of that moment when we lift each other up? This is one of the reasons why something like the Vancouver Writers Festival is so important. You know, Billy-Ray, you and I have been able to sit on stages and talk and be in community with each other and understand each other, you know, through these discussions. I mean, true, it's usually under a lot of surveillance. But it's also
a lot of flies on the wall.
Yeah. But it's also quite a beautiful and intimate kind of community making. It's how I met, you know, I just have to also say this, Vancouver, because I was just in Toronto. Y'all got the best writers out here. What is up? Like, I'm sitting here with Billy-Ray Belcourt. The legendary Jay Simpson is sitting there in this beautiful hat with her shades on, right? Like, you just honestly, this is such a beautiful community, and so I really thought about that when I was bringing these witches together, about, you know, what is that power of connectivity when we hold each other up? And it's family making.
Now I'm imagining what would happen if, you know, 7 Indigenous writers came together in our own little fellowship.
It would be so loud. It would be so loud.
What would our communal text be?
They would, I don't know. Jay would be moderating, for sure. She would be keeping us all in check. Would
there'd be a lot of jokes.
There'd be a lot. Well, I would say jokes, and then you would break them down on the pedagogy of the origin of each stream of humor. And I would do what I always do when you are like so smart. I go, "Oh, I love him. He's so sweet." And then he's like, "I'm a grown man. Please stop."
No, I love that though, because it's like there's a certain kind of seriousness that intellectual, you know, inquiry asks someone to perform, and then on the other hand, there's the humor and the groundedness that
and there's so much wisdom in that humor, though, right? And this is the thing. Humor is a kind of magic, and I've often said this. Laughter is the biggest sound, and it does the job of clearing the space so that real work can happen. So it pushes back the boundaries so that we have the room to fully be with each other and do the hard work that needs to happen. And that's so much of our stories, you know, that are couched and carried and protected, wrapped with humor. It's a good way to take your medicine, because really there's a lot of medicine in those stories and understandings to move forward. Mm-hmm.
And there's so many laugh out loud jokes in this book. They're even set up like punchlines. Do you see yourself as a comedian?
No way. I'm just corny. Jeez.
I can imagine you doing like a roast.
I could do a roast. We should do. Where's Leslie? Leslie, we're doing next year's festival.
A literary
roast. We don't know who yet. It could be anyone. Yeah, we'll do it.
And some of this humor is, you know, very queer humor also. And the book is very LGBTQ. You know, the whole spectrum.
He means sexy. Just super hot.
And the whole spectrum is represented really, which is rare. And I wondered, I think you've already sort of answered this stuff from the outset. You were imagining the story was a queer story.
Yeah. First of all, and I said this in the green room, I feel like it is I feel like my ancestors put me here to bring back the era of the bisexual villain. I feel like it's my sovereign duty to make sure that every good villain is very hot, really sarcastic, and super bi. Also, I will sort of just caveat that by saying that, did you know that my clan is the Beaver clan? And that's the truth. But also, I feel like that's a part of it. Like, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. So a part of it is truly the fact that, again, there was no like, this is what I should do. It was truly about the kind of joy that I wanted to examine, the kind of magic that exists. And so who are those people that have carried the magic through, right? Who are the people who have walked the hardest road and carried that weight? And here's the beautiful thing about so many queer narratives is that, we all have burdens, we all carry that weight. And in so many queer narratives, it's not a weight that is at the top of your head and pushes you down, that keeps you your shoulders slumped and your pace slow. It is a weight at the small of your back that pushes you forward. And so I wanted to examine that structure. And I don't know. It's just here's the other thing is, it was the pandemic, and I was in my pajamas, with my dog, sharing editorial notes with him. He's not much help. And I wanted to feel joy. I needed to feel joy in that moment. And so this story for me was going to be, very witchy and hella gay. And that made me really happy.
It's very sexy, as you said. And do you have any, I get asked all the time what my approach is to writing about sex, because all my books
are super hot.
Are about sex.
Yeah, they're crazy hot. You're crazy hot, Billy-Ray. You're like a sex symbol in Canlit.
I didn't know if I'd go that far, but
pass that one around. Pass it around.
You're like new gossip.
Here's the tea, Billy-Ray.
And there's this sort of conventional craft knowledge that sex scenes can delegitimize a story. And that's like old craft knowledge, and we're already sort of dispensing with it, and sort of a newer generation of writers is ignoring that knowledge, or that lesson that wasn't really a lesson. It was more like a normalizing imposition. And I'm just curious, how do you approach writing about sex, and what do you hope that it generates in a reader?
Yeah, I hope it generates people reading with one hand. No, I hope. I'm really sorry, Mom, if you're watching on the live stream. I think that what we inherited was this sort of was exactly a very Christian Western approach to sex, which is the one thing that I refuse that any of my characters should have, and that is shame.
Yeah.
And I think shame is it's old news. We don't need it. We don't need it to inform it. We can talk about it because it's an unwanted gift that we keep being given. Like every Christmas, part of my Catholic Métis family delivers a gift of shame, and I'm like, please, this doesn't fit me anymore. Please take it back. And so I really want to liberate my characters from shame, and so a part of that is feeling absolutely beautiful in the most vulnerable moment, which is sex, right? And I remember reading early that when you're talking about character development, there are a few ways to really fast forward into your character development if you want to get into the story and so you understand who it is that you're reading and living with. And one of those ways is to literally strip them naked and leave them vulnerable, because there's something that we should become very honest in that moment. And so you can't abandon your characters in that moment. You can't abandon them. You have to sit with them, and you have to hold that space. And I think there's such a beautiful quality. There's something so ethereal about that moment of trust, especially when you're creating a character. And I think, there's something also very connective. Mm-hmm. If we can put aside the shame and we can joke about it and we can accept each other as we are, it becomes a very beautiful communion between people. And I'm not saying, to be clear, I'm not talking about making love here. All right, that's for Harlequins. Nobody's bosom is heaving. It's not wholesome. All right, this is like real, like sex, like the kind of sex that you're like, oh, I'm gonna think about that later. I'm here in this moment right now, and it's great, but also I'm gonna pull that one up later. And that's all of us, right? We all have that moment, and so we've been so used to putting it in, putting it away, or denying it. Like, okay, I'm gonna tell you guys something. So just today, before I got here, I went into my email, as one does, and I got an email from one of those scammers, and they were like, hello, sir, and I was like, good day, and he was like, just so you know, I have hacked into your computer, and I have access to all your files, and I also see that you like to visit adult websites. And it's, this mass email they send out to people. And I have captured videos of you pleasuring yourself. And I will release them to your contacts unless you send me, and this was very specific, $794 US. Maybe he was behind in his rent. Immediately. Or I'm going to send these pictures of you to everyone. And my first thought was like, wow, they need to do like a grammar check, was my first thought on these mass scams. And then my second thought was, oh my God, I hope if this is real, I hope I look cute. Like, I hope I'm wearing something like beautiful, and I'm making like like something really iconic. And obviously it was a scam or whatever, but there was the moment where I'm like, imagine if we didn't have, he was literally trying to get $794 US out of me, betting on the fact that I would be ashamed that perhaps I went to a porn site and masturbated. And so I responded with dear sir, I'm in Canada, so I'm confused about the US dollars, although I do understand it's 20% more. Also, if you would like recommendations for websites, I can send you a list.
And you can send the PDF of VenCo.
And I can send him a PDF of VenCo. And I can highlight, I can be like, look for the character J. Christos. Find him on those pages, because he's doing bad bisexual stuff. I feel like when I say bisexual and villain, I'm being redundant. Like, it's just kind of, I can just say bisexual and everyone's like, oh, he's a bad guy. I hope.
I feel like the fantasy novel allows you to not have to make all these kinds of concessions that you might have to in a realist novel. And at least since the Marrow Thieves, your work has been, very much situated in that genre. This is the fantasy novel and of magic. Was there a moment where that sort of clicked for you, that was where you were sort of maybe most in your element? Yeah.
I think it's because I'm a little bit ridiculous, to be honest. I think my imagination is I was going to say prolific, but then problematic was what came to my, and I almost said it, and then I was like, don't say that. I think, there is something freeing about it. And here's what's freeing about it is that you can be atmospheric, and here's what I love about writing in this way is that I don't want to give precise descriptions that logically make sense to you. I want you to feel it. I want you to feel exactly what that moment should be. So I don't want to have to go through the process of the different steps. No offense to academia and all the great work you do. because it's great work. Not your books. Your books are wildly fantastic and also super hot. But I just want to deliver a feeling. And that's also something that's really interesting to me about, when I was looking at witchcraft, the idea of, I had an interviewer the other day ask me, have you ever done any spells? And I was like, who am I talking to again? But anyway, so they asked the question and I thought about it because I was like, have I done, certainly I've accidentally hexed people that I may have dated, but I don't, not on purpose. But then I realized, okay, so what is a spell? It's generally words that are said or written in a certain sequential order and that are imbued with intent to create an impact. So, I think that's kind of my career. I think I'm a career spellist. I know that's not a word. I made it up. I'm a career spellist. That's something we're also going to hold on to from tonight, guys. Billy-Ray is a sex icon in Canlit, and spellist is a word. Those are the two lessons.
The two takeaways.
The two takeaways.
And I feel like my sense is that there's the reality of Indigenous life, full of joy, full of struggle, simultaneously, and the fantasy novel and these sort of magical conceits, I think, allow for a certain kind of nuance to be imbued, but also it's like the possibility of another kind of world is inherent.
Right. Because what day passes that we don't imagine what, not necessarily decolonization, but uncolonized, what an uncolonized existence could be, right? It's that dream space. It's why the dream space is so important in a lot of work, like, well, even in this book, but in particular in the Marrow Thieves, it's like, what is the space that is fully and wholly ours, uninformed and untouched by anyone else, and what are the ways in which we would protect that? Yeah. Sorry, I cut off your question.
No, that was the question.
Oh.
For some reason, I'm thinking of there's this psychoanalyst named Adam Phillips. Okay. He writes like psychoanalysis for general audiences, and I just read one of his books, and there's a bit about he's drawing on Freud, and he's sort of like a critical Freudian, thinking about dreams, and the way that the evening is like it readies us to dream. And I feel like your work sort of inhabits that space of sort of you're readying us to dream.
Oh my God, I love that. Billy-Ray Belcourt.
And one of the ways that's so evident is, as you've already noted, the joy that is just so prevalent in the book, even as it's a sort of classic tale of good versus evil, and but there's still so much joy throughout, even in the face of struggle.
It's Billy-Ray, it's one of the reasons why. So in the book you'll see there's even on the cover there's spoons. So I'll quickly tell you the story behind that. It's that I really wanted to tell a witch story. I wanted witches throughout literature and cinema, we know, have held space for stories that we weren't allowed to tell, in particular for the queer community. And so they held that space. They were the gender non-conforming badasses that, weren't out there they were living in the forest, like smoking cigarettes and like sleeping with whoever they wanted, and like, making potions and laughing hysterically and not worrying about what was happening in the village until, of course, the village marched up to their house with fire. But they really were the sentinels of that space until we could reclaim that to tell the stories. And so I wanted to reclaim the space, but also honor the sentinels that kept that space. So when I was thinking about it, I thought I really want to narrow in on this idea of the mundane, right? The magical and the mundane, the extraordinary and the ordinary. And so I wanted the object that they coveted, the thing that brought them together, to be something very ordinary. So it wasn't going to be some like highfalutin wand. Now you know exactly how old I am. I said highfalutin. Anyway, some highfalutin wand or some crystal or some, or they had to be like a part of this dynasty that was predestined from whatever. So I thought about what that object could be, and I thought I want it to be something from souvenir culture. Because souvenir culture, we know souvenirs are kind of gaudy and they're cheap and you get them and then you lose them and you don't miss them. And I thought about my mare, my grandmother, who had these hideous silver spoons from all over, okay? Now, for the first point to that is, she didn't travel. I don't know how she got these spoons. She was not like in the Yukon. She sure as hell didn't do spring break in Cancun. I don't know how she had spoons from these places. I think actually she thrifted them, I think is what happened. At the mall, which was the Salvation Army. I don't know why she just called it the mall. And
there's a way people like manifest that. They sort of speak that into people. Give them spoons.
Yeah, I think she probably got one spoon from like a weekend trip to Toronto, and then everyone was like, "Oh, she collects spoons. We need to pick up a spoon for Edna." And then she ended up with spoons from all over to places she'd never been, which I think is taunting her. But she loved them, and they used to. So she got those holders. You guys know. Right? Those friggin', it looked like a trophy plaque, but like for a trophy you never want it to win. And it had a holder for them all. And so I thought, it's gonna be these spoons because they're hideous and nobody wants, you get them and then you're like, what do I do now? Do I leave them in an inheritance to my least favorite grandchild? Like, what do I do? So I thought this is what it's gonna be. So it's gonna be odd because I want people to know that there's potential for magic and everything. So then I thought, oh shit, I don't know anything about souvenir spoons because who would have studied the history of souvenir spoons? So I was like, well, that's going to be me today. So I went on, Google, and I wish it was cooler, but I just went on Google and I put in North American souvenir spoons. And it turns out, friends, that the very first collectible spoon in North America was issued in 1892 out of Salem, Massachusetts. And it was made by a jeweler whose store was in a church that used to be a meeting house where they held the witch trials. And the spoon was in celebration and commemoration of the 1692 Salem witch trials. And so I thought, okay, universe, that's a little on the nose.
Message received.
I get it. I'm writing as fast as I can. Oh, and I have a ring that was made from one of them, and they are exactly, don't steal it. They are exactly as they are in the book. And you can actually find them. People do have them, on, I don't know, eBay or whatever. Mm-hmm. So I got one. And I'm telling you, it's just a souvenir spoon, but that shit is in a frame in my living room like it is across from the Vatican. Because I cannot believe it exists. Yeah.
Speaking of the cross from the Vatican.
Ooh.
Now, there's a deep religiosity to the book.
Absolutely.
There's this sort of melding of various religious traditions, spiritual practices. Yeah. I'm assuming that was intentional. You wanted to look at the ways that all these forces kind of mingle.
Absolutely, absolutely. So besides, doing these deep dives on Appalachian folk magic and granny women and Pennsylvania powwow practitioners, which, by the way, they're Dutch, not native, but the tradition is called Pennsylvania powwow. Thelema, Order of the Golden Dawn, Gardinian Wicca, the fairy tradition, all these different folk magic grounded spiritual beliefs. Métis people for the large part were Catholic. We're Catholic, but also in the way that my very Catholic grandmother used to say "goddamn" and not feel bad about it. So you know what I'm saying? It's a very specific kind of. It's like the Mary statue that she had with her sisters, that was the most important thing. And it was this little plastic Mary that you could like buy at the shrine, and then they would like literally they'd rub it for good luck, and so like she had no face. So she was terrifying. When I was younger, I'd be like, oh my God, I cannot do anything sexy in this room because Mary's there and her face is half melted and I don't know what she's capable of. Anyways, so it's a very specific kind of catechism, but it is there. And I wanted to break that down because here's the thing. In no way am I, suggesting that one belief system is sort of, there's one belief system to lead them all. In fact, I would argue, I think probably successfully, that that's a part of the problem.
Yeah.
is believing that there's one belief system that sits on top of, one to rule them all, like the Highlander of religions, right? So yes, it is definitely in there, and it should be, it woven through it so that it makes you question things. There's a lot of storylines in there that seem like, okay, this is just how things are, and then they switch up or they become glaringly obvious. And a part of that is because I wanted to really challenge people that things, this world isn't the way it is because that's how it is. Somebody very purposefully and carefully constructed it to be this way, which then means there is a way to deconstruct it. There is a way to move forward. I mean, let's face it, right? Capitalism is not something that just happened. It wasn't the natural progression of civilization. It's not how things were heading once the feudal system ended. The feudal system ended, there was a mass resistance and rebellion, and the response to the resistance was the capitalist system. And it was about taking back all the commonly held lands and evicting the people who lived on those lands and those commonly held places and privatizing it and making everyone go out and have to, earn a wage. And so who were the people that were on these common lands? For the most part, they were widowed women, they were the elderly, they were people who did not conform to gendered roles. And they lived as this community, and they provided food for other people, and in turn took care of themselves. And when that land was privatized, they were removed. And this is where we get that idea of, the witches skulking around, these elderly beggars, because that's kind of where they were relegated through this system. Yeah.
It makes me think of one of Ursula Le Guin's very famous sayings, which was, capitalism seems inescapable. Its power seems, endless, but so did the divine right of kings.
Yes, yes, exactly. And here's the thing, right? It's we kind of feel like this is it, it's inevitable, and this is where we are, and what's the solution? Well, I mean, one, it was an experiment, and it's obviously failing. Right? I mean, how many billionaires do we need before we understand that it's an experiment that has failed? Mm-hmm. We are careening, they're sort of, I talk to young people now and I'm like, what's your plans for the future? And they're like, well, I'm going to be dead thanks to you and your generation. I'm like, you're not wrong. I'm sorry. But, this is it. But the great news is, and this is a part of the joy of being a part of those, quote unquote outliers, of being from that group that stands at the side and refuses to be a part of the system, is that there is a way forward, there is a way to change. And I just firmly believe that the people at the table who are trying to come up with solutions, sorry, I'm going to rephrase that. I firmly believe that the white man sitting at the table should finish eating and get up from the table because they're no longer needed there. They don't have the answers. And so, the challenge of this book was not, hey, Cherie, in your pajamas in the middle of the pandemic, how do you tear down the patriarchy? The challenge was just, who are the right people to sit at that table to start talking about the solution?
Mm-hmm. And I think what I love about the novel is that you turn your attention to the way that the witch trials were partly a response to a fear of a non-patriarchal system or non-exploitative system. in that sort of the spirit of a non-patriarchal, non-exploitative system is sort of alive still in your characters for sure, but in the world also.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so crazy when you look at history. It becomes so glaring. Like it's hard to imagine that this was a belief system that we still sort of push forward. I mean, I've been in our communities where people will sort of dismissively call the people who are like ceremonial leaders or traditional people witches to this day, right, as an insult. And so it's interesting because when you look at it, even something, and I'm sure we all know this story, that the brewery houses in Germany were run by women, right? That was the women's job. They ran the brewery houses, and when they became really profitable, the men decided, hey, that would be cool. Maybe we want to do that. And so the way to remove those women from, owning all these profitable breweries was to declare them witches. And so interestingly, the uniform that those women wore in the brewery houses were really tall, pointed hats with buckles on the front. And so that's where we get the witch's hat, sort of imagery to this day. And that's one example, right? It is one of the ways, that why they, you have to declare. I mean, okay, well, let's look at let's just say it. Let's look at a really obvious way that calling somebody, demonic or in league with the devil was used erroneously. I don't know when it would ever be used right, but was used erroneously for gain. Let's talk about the fact that when Europeans came here, what they were looking for was, first of all, these mass silver and gold that they imagined were here in North America and South America. And then, of course, the fur trade, and then, of course, the timber, and then, of course, the land, and on and on and on. And so what do? Do you go back and do you say, hey, we're assholes, and what we would like to do is take over this land for all the riches it could give us? Or do you go back and ask for an audience with the Pope and say, we've run into a civilization of devils. They're cannibals, they haven't found God, and we want to save their souls. Can you stand in support of this mission? And of course, we know that's what happened. That's what he did. So there's ways in which you can weaponize belief and fear.
Totally.
That was light, right? We went from talking about my cyber stalker to full colonization in 15 minutes. It's the Billy-Ray Belcourt effect, guys.
I do want to shift gears to something,
of course,
less heavy, which is the topic of plot. So I wrote a novel recently. It is plotless. So reading your novel, I was sort of amazed at the amount of information that you have to hold all the time, especially across the span of the book. So you write the kind of novels that require, in my opinion, from my point of view, immense authorial restraint. So you have to sort of, you give glimmers of something, or you a little window onto something and then it's revoked, or you sort of, a small image can turn out to be consequential later, or as is the sort of that final reveal. Can you talk about how you approach plot and placing and sort of pacing, and does it feel difficult?
Yes, and I will say this is where rewriting comes in. So there are authors who map out everything, who have very tidily pulled up calendars to keep track of the days and the hours. Totally. And that's not me. That's Eden Robinson. I saw a picture of Eden Robinson's workspace once, and I was like, honestly, you're the funniest, smartest, most beloved, and now the neatest. Well done, Marie Kondo. Well done. But it is one of those things where I fall in love 1,000 times in a story, and I fall in love with an idea, and I just go with it, and then as it builds out, and becomes larger, and I start to see, the threads that are which direction they're going in. You have to go back in and kind of clip them or not, put little knots in it. I don't know why I chose that metaphor. I don't know how to knit or anything. It was poor choice. Anyway, so you have to go back in and do that work. You have to really finish things up and put in your emphasis, like shine a light into certain corners. And that's one of the things I learned from Lee Miracle, who, so I wrote a first draft of my second book, and I was really immensely proud of myself. And if you're ever proud of yourself, go see a mean auntie. So I was really proud of myself, so I went and I was like, I did it. I wrote this tremendous book. It's going to be great. It was not great, friends. Spoiler alert. And she said, oh, you're real happy. You're real proud of yourself. I said, yeah. And she's like, you understand that the first draft is just vomiting. And I was like, what? This is 300 pages of my best work. And she said, if that's your best work, then you should probably go apply at the coffee shop now. She was amazing. She was very tough. But that was one of the, then she explained it. She said, the first draft is you sitting at she said typewriter. That's how old she was. Sitting at the computer, sitting at the typewriter, she said, and just letting it all out, and it's a relief, right? When you have that story and it's building and the characters, and it's that ache. You're like, oh, I have to get this out. I can't. They won't let me forget them. I can't lose them, and so you just have to pour it out. She said the art and the craft of writing is in the rewrites. It's in those moments where you think, what do I have? What's missing? Where do I need a window? Where is it heavy enough that there should be a door so people can leave into a different storyline? Where do I need to shine the lights? And probably most importantly, where must the shadows remain? So it is that I would like to say that I'm very disciplined and that just came out like that, but that is not what happened. Yeah, Billy-Ray. It was like one, mad dash to the finish line, because not for a deadline, but just because you when a story is there, you just have to put it, you have to get it out. And then it's the work of sort of the archaeological dig of it all.
Totally. It can even feel a little oppressive, like just the fact that you have to finish something. Yeah. I have some questions here that were sent. And a similar note about, so I asked you about restraint. This question is about constraint. So that it's about how do you sort of like hem in the world of a fantasy novel, since there's always the possibility of splintering off and all these multitudes and whatnot. Yeah.
For me, it's about the central relationship, really. So even if it's a singular character and there's not necessarily a big relationship in that storyline, there is then indeed the relationship that the character has with themselves, because there's always some sort of growth, right? Your character needs to move. They need to get somewhere. And that's the drive. That's the emotional connection that we have. You could have, when you watch like an action movie and then at the end you're like, what happened? Because you watched it for 2 hours, you ate all the snacks, but you have no memory of what happened. So Jason Statham took his shirt off, I think. I don't even know, right? Because there's no growth, so you don't have a connection to that character. So for me, the constraint comes from, there's usually, and sometimes there's more layers, but at the very least, there is the central sort of intimate relationship and the growth that happens, and that should feel very familiar. And even when it's not familiar, because this character's point of view is very different from your own, there is something very human that we can all connect to. And then there's the larger story that kind of, but the nucleus is that central piece. And so whenever I feel myself kind of going off and suddenly there's, 2 bisexual villains, I'm like, that is one too many, sir. So I go back to that central character and think about how would this impact this central piece that I can't compromise.
Are you a quick writer?
I am.
Yeah.
I am. I wrote, The Marrow Thieves was written in 6 weeks.
Wow.
That sounds impressive, right? I rewrote it 11 times. Right? Yeah.
But so you're a quick first drafter.
I'm a quick first drafter. Yes, I'm like quick because there's that I become consumed. Like literally my family like slips sandwiches under the door. Sometimes they literally put sandwiches under the door, and that's not good. You gotta flatten that out first. It's not good because I just lock myself in, and I'm in love. I'm absolutely in the throes of that like first passionate love, and then I'm having my first big fight. You know, the one that makes you question everything in life. But that it's happening in the story, and I'm like, and then people get worried about me, and then my mom shows up and is like, why don't you come out into the garden? And I'm like, I can't. Do you not understand what I'm doing? And she's like, no, I don't. But then the work after. So then I get the edits. How are you, Billy-Ray, when you get your edits back?
I have to have that moment of like, some of this will feel devastating, and I have to live with that.
So my editor now at Random House has this sort of the way that she delivers her edits to me. And so when she calls, and I'm waiting for them to show up in email, and they don't, and she calls and says, hey, I want to take you to lunch.
And you're like,
I'm
stomach
like,
drop.
Oh, no. And then we go to the good place for lunch. And then she orders a bottle of wine for lunch. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be so bad. And then she'll send me off with like a tote bag of like printed up pages that have all those like red lines on it. Why do they do everything in red? It's like teachers do it in red. It's like, you are wrong. And you know you're wrong because it's in red ink. Oh, it just cuts right through, you know?
The lipstick message on RuPaul's Drag Race.
Oh my God.
But I think, you know, at this point in my, you know, writing life, it is clear to me that editors really are there to, you know, protect you from your worst writing tendencies.
Yes. Do you do the thing? So my editor, Ann Collins, she always says, stop clearing your throat. Just say what you want to say. Stop clearing your throat. And I'm like, excuse me, ma'am, those are 6 expertly crafted metaphors. And she's like, oh, you needed 6 perfectly crafted metaphors to say it was cold?
So I think I have the opposite problem.
Are you like really spare?
Which is that my editor was like, maybe some subtext would be better here. You don't need to spell everything out. So yeah, I think I have the opposite problem.
And you're like, I'm a poet. I don't need to give you subtext.
I was like, I'm a Libra. I have to spell everything out. There's a question here also. I think you're sort of one of those writers that immediately, you know, there's TV, film interest around you. And this person says they have not read the new novel yet, but they did love both The Marrow Thieves and Hunting by Stars. And they want to know what's going on, what's the status
of
those
status?
projects, if they're, you know,
I love it.
being developed.
Yeah, so The Marrow Thieves very early on did go into development. And I'm going to be very, very honest with you. It's no longer in active development, and that's because I sort of pulled it aside. There was, you know, a lot going on in Canadian television that I thought they needed to figure out first before they took on this very precious story. And I'll tell you the reason why is because that story is for, and I don't say it's for Indigenous youth, it's theirs. It is their story. It is something that I wrote for them. It belongs to them. And one of the things that I always heard was, if you're going to tell a story, you need to stand for it. You need to, you know, Lee always used to say, like, these are your grandmothers, these stories. So you always need to protect your grandmothers. So you need to stand for them, no matter what. And so when things got, you know, very controversial in Canadian TV, I felt like I had to stand for that story and pull it back, because I didn't want it to get turned into something that it wasn't, because it was a gift that I had already given. So it was no longer mine to change in any big ways. So I've held it for a bit. And here's the thing is, there's other great stories that have come out that have that sort of same kind of apocalyptic tone to it that I think are phenomenal, that are fantastic and do that work really well. Empire of Wild has just recently been optioned for screen. So that's something that I'll be working on in the next few months. VenCo was optioned from an early draft of a manuscript, which is really unusual, and it was picked up by AMC Networks. And so I'm working with the producer who did the Killing Eve series. And I'm writing the pilot right now, actually.
Round of applause. That's really exciting.
It's very exciting. It's also really strange.
Yeah.
It's a totally different world, and it's still your stories, right? Well, you'll get there. Oh, which reminds me, I need to ask you about the book that's coming up, sir.
Yeah.
Your next book next year. Tell us about it. Oh, look
oh
who
my
I
God,
just
like that
looked at.
already
Give me
is-
the iPad. I'm the interviewer now.
It does feel very fancy to have this at my
I
disposal.
know. I'm jealous. Tell us.
Yeah, I was like, that's already next year.
That's what I mean.
Yeah,
It's
It's
tell
a
us
collection
about
of
it.
short stories. And I was thinking when you're talking a bit. Oh no, I listened to a podcast that you were on, where you're talking about Empire Wild, and you were mentioning writing characters that you like personally as the author you detest, but you have to show them a certain amount of empathy so that they feel real and dimensional. And it made me think of this, what I'm working on now with the short stories that it's really about, there are several relationships. Because I was thinking one day, I was in Ottawa for a festival, and I was thinking, there are so few queer Indigenous love stories that in which the characters stay together, and that they're both queer and both Indigenous. So I wanted to write that. But then I also wrote this other story of, queer men in their 40s, and it's a breakup, and it's first person, so it's only from one person's point of view. And I realized that, of course there was some projecting happening.
No.
And I was standing with the first person narrator, and I had to realize, even though it felt like personally heartbreaking, I was like, I have to allow this other character, to deservedly, want to leave this relationship that I've invented.
Oh, we all
so really,
invent
it's a book about love, really.
I cannot wait. I honestly cannot. Every time you do something new, which is every year, show off.
I mean,
All right.
that's both our gig.
Yeah, that's kind of our thing. But your work has such a. So when you were talking about writing sex scenes and that the difficulty because of sort of the climate of how sex and literature has been devalued. It's the same way genre was devalued, right? You guys remember that? Like if you wrote science fiction or fantasy, they're like, oh, but when are you going to be a real author? And I'm like, I don't know. Why don't you drive up to Stephen King's mansion and ask him when he's going to be a real author? But there's just such a glorious wallowing in humanity, and I mean like just fully like if you like. I could talk about your work forever. Like when you're swimming and you hold your breath, and there's just that moment when you're like what if I tried to take a breath? There's just that sort of nihilistic like you want to live in every cell. There's just like that glorious freedom. That's what it feels like going into your work. It's like I want it all, and it's gonna hurt, and I don't know where it's gonna take me, but it's going to be somewhere totally new. And I'm going to feel these beautiful things. So I'm really super excited for your new book.
Yeah, thank
What
you.
is it called? Tell everyone.
It's called Coexistence.
Coexistence.
And one of the the tasks I set myself was to write a book. Finally, there was my first book, which I imagine as, I think of it as being, accessible. And then I had the, 3 books in between that, my grad school era books. And I thought, with this, with this next one, that I would try to return to the spirit of This Wound Is a World, and
oh my God, it's going to win every award.
accessibly.
That's what you just said to me. You're like, I'm going to write this book, and it's going to be like my first book that blew the entire universe away. But it's also going to be accessible. So like, see you at the Gillers.
You should be at the marketing table when that happens. We're sort of running out of time, but I
knew it.
I want to extend a bit of bestie privilege to my bestie, who's Jay, and I know Jay is a huge fan of your work, and they told me they have some questions for you. So, do you have a question for Cherie?
Oh.
Thank you so much. I'm going to tell the world how I got the book early, but So I finished it. One of the things, and I had to text Billy-Ray, I wanted to call, but I had to put the book down, not going to give any spoilers, and cry. You've talked a lot about it, and I'm a huge fan of making villains bisexual again, so
Yes.
I'm going to back you up on that one if anyone comes for you with
Okay.
that as a villainous bisexual.
Lived experience.
Villainous gay again. When it's been very rare that I see folks write a trans woman's experience honestly and inclusive, especially in witchcraft. Why? Why was that such an important part for you to include?
Thank you. So one of the witches, Freya, is trans, and here's why she was absolutely. The story could not have been written without her. There's a huge community of non-binary, queer, and specifically trans witches in places like North Carolina. And one of the ways that, and I've read so much of what these witches have to say in their own words, and one of the ways that they sum it up is that there is always an element of survival in magic, right? That the ways in which so many people have survived can be attributed to magic, to belief. And the ways in which they fully embody, which we talked about, that the resistance and the joy within that resistance, and the weight that propels them forward. And there's, Freya. When I thought of her as a character, I was so worried because she was so important, and I thought, how am I going to get this right? And I couldn't leave her out. Like, that's the thing, right? You come across a character or a storyline, and you're like, this is so difficult. And this is where, it would be easier to sort of move away from it. But because this story is about survival and holy joy, and because it is about power, if you took Freya out, it would be erasure. It would be wrong.
Yeah.
The circle could not be complete. And so that's something that I spent a lot of time on and sought a lot of counsel. And then truly the moment where, when I put aside all my anxiety and I was like, who is this girl? Who is this beautiful girl? Let's just live with her for a moment. And she was actually the one character that I ended up keeping a diary for, which is kind of a strange existential, thing, but I needed to live with her as this powerhouse. And the beautiful gift that she gives is her vulnerability and unimagined strength in the same moment, which if you've never met Jay Simpson, would be very familiar. It's this absolute directness that is so generous. And actually, we were talking about you when you weren't in the green room, and we agreed that is such a beautiful gift that you give to us, is that you stand for all of us when you don't have to. And it is this directness and power that is so generous. It's this generosity of spirit. So I wanted Freya to have that same J-ness about her. and so it's a good question why it's that the story could not have existed without her, to be honest. Mm-hmm. She's absolutely essential.
And I think that's a really valuable craft lesson too, because there's a lot of, like in MFA programs, which is I teach in one, on Twitter also. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of discourse about how imagining fictional worlds that don't eclipse so many facets of people who live in the world. Yeah. And sometimes it is as simple as that, which is that, without these people, the story would be incomplete.
That's the thing, right? And we talk about this a lot in craft, and I've been in conversations with the writers where they're like, well, I don't want to include all of these communities because then somebody might come for me or I might get in trouble. And I'm like, but if you don't include, like, if you write a story on Indigenous land and there's no Indigenous characters, where did we go? right? That's erasure. You're making something that has so much depth and beauty very shallow, so that it's neat and easy. And life isn't easy.
Totally.
It's a beautiful struggle, you know?
And then
we
there's
just have to live in
the accountability mechanism as well, which is that, you know, if you had done poorly, you know, Jay might have said something different, you know?
Oh,
which
I
is
know.
that, like, and sort of opening yourself up to that accountability process.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Because what's going to happen is if you have reached out to the community and you have read community stories, not about a community, any community, but from the community, of the community, right? So that's the starting point. Like, you think you want to include this storyline or this character. Well, do you know them? You better at least know them. And then it's about building in the mechanisms after that. So of course you look at the issues. So what are some of the issues impacting the community, any community, right? So you need to know the beauty and the struggles. You can't just sort of take a voice. And then it's about building it into the publishing system. So before anything goes out, you should have people from that community looking at it. And then the other side of it is, at the end, once it's out in the world, you need to be able to listen, actively listen. You know? So I was ready when I saw Jay was reading the book. I'm like, oh my God, her opinion's so important to me. What's gonna happen? But I was ready and to listen. You know, that's important, because a book is a conversation, right? So it's not just like, this is what I have to say and it's out there and that's reality. No, it's a conversation. And there's always an opportunity for all of us. And I think it's interesting because in the publishing world a lot, they do this thing where they're like, well, you're from a minority group, so maybe we don't need sensitivity readers. And I'm like, I'm from one community, like one specific, like hokey little, they're like, basically I come from half-breed hillbillies, like literally, right? That's that's my experience. There's the whole world out there. And that's also a very unfair weight to sort of put on us, right? Like, you speak for everyone. I barely speak for myself. You know?
Well, that's a fun note to end on. Buy this book. Cherie Dimaline, author who barely speaks for herself. I'm just teasing you.
Thank you, too. I don't think I'd heard so much laughter in an event in a long time, so that was fantastic. Thanks, everyone, for being here and for laughing with us. Our friends from Massy Books are here selling books. They have a 15% off discount, so get your book here. Get it signed at that table over there, so you're going to line up around that way. Not yet. I'm just going to tell you about one more event that we're doing tomorrow that I think you'll be interested in. It's the last event of our Black History Month series. And it'll be a conversation between Shalene Knight about her debut novel, Junie, which is a story about a mother and a daughter that takes place in the 1930s in Hogan's Alley. It's a phenomenal book, and that's going to be online, so you can check in on Zoom webinar. It's at 7 p.m., and we're hosting it through the library channel, so go on our website and you'll find out all the details on how to connect at 7 tomorrow. Les George is going to send us off with a beautiful song, so please welcome him again.
He sang this song, and we still use this song today in ceremonies when we welcome the newborns, or when we see our loved ones go on to what we call the spirit world. And he sang the song everywhere. He traveled around the world and throughout America and throughout Canada. And he shared this song, and when he shared this song in many villages, they liked this song, and the chiefs and the leaders and the matriarchs, they asked if they could adopt this song. And being the humble man my grandfather was, he agreed. And the Slay, which is first song, is also known as the Coast Salish Anthem. And that's a song I'd like to share with you for the night. And I thank you. In our culture, we raise our hands. We say, Hoichka, thank you for the work that you're doing and for the words that you said. Oh, see you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night. See you soon. You can line up there to get your book signed. Thank you.